Welcome everybody. Many thanks for joining us. This is the first of 4 live Zoom discussions as part of COPnes26. These events have been planned to enable informed, transparent and open debate on the environmental crisis as part of the COPnes26 festival. There will be a copy of the discussion available after the event, so people can revisit, but also those who couldn't attend can benefit from the information that's been shared and the knowledge and ideas. Everybody who's viewing should be automatically muted, and your video will be off to preserve the bandwidth so that we can ensure that we've got a good continuity of discussion without bandwidth issues. Everyone will be able to use the chat during the discussion. And do use the chat to share ideas, articles, news reports, call attention to any useful sources that you would like to share. You will also be able to post questions for the panel into the chat. And we'll be monitoring the chat and we'll pull questions out to pose to the panel as we progress. We will get through as many chat questions as possible in the time allowed. If you cannot hear one of the panelists, please let us know via the chat so that we can fix the problem. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout, so if there are any technical issues, just let us know straight away. We'd like to welcome and thank our panelists because they've agreed to participate in open and informed discussion, and we're extremely grateful for their participation. So thank you, panel. I'm going to introduce the discussion panel. Okay, so we have Phil Baker, who's Strategic Planner with Southampton's West Devon and Plymouth Councils. We have Professor Peter Connor, National Renewable Energy Policy and Regulation, Exeter University. We have Simon Oldridge from Sustainable South Hams. We've got Councillor Judy Pearce Ward, Councillor for Salcombe and Thurlestone and leader of SHDC Council. And we've got Joanne Williamson, Historic Building Surveyor, Climate Change Adaptation, Historic England. So we've got a terrific panel, very knowledgeable, and looking forward to speaking with everybody this evening. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to play a little video to get us into the mood, okay? And then I will open up the discussion with our panelists. So I'm going to share my screen. What I'd like to do is I'd just like to ask our panelists just to introduce themselves for 2 minutes each, just about who they are, what they do, and their particular angle of interest in this particular discussion topic, which is levelling up in a climate crisis. So I wonder if we could start with Councillor Judy Pearce. Could you start by introducing yourself? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's really good to be with you this evening. I'm the leader of Southampton's District Council and Ward Councillor for the Salcombe and Thurlestone Ward. I've long had an interest in the sustainability of buildings, and I see this as a very important part of both the climate change agenda and levelling up for 2 reasons. first of all, I think it's 30% of all the carbon emissions are from buildings, and it's therefore, it ought to be a priority in the South Hams that we tackle this problem, and we have a lot of buildings that aren't fit for purpose, so we need to do that. And secondly, people who live in poorly insulated buildings are spending an awful lot of money on trying to keep warm or not being able to keep warm because they can't afford it. And in either case, if they were to live in a properly insulated building, then they will be warm and comfortable and have a lot more energy to do other things. And so I do see this as a very, very important part of levelling up. That's probably enough from me for the time being, but I have sat on planning committees for about 17 years, so I'm fairly up on what the present regulations are. And I suppose one of the troubles is that planning is always about 5 years behind what the present agenda is, because once you've got planning permission, you don't have to build it out for a while, and the regulations can't keep up, I'm afraid. So that's the position, that's one of the bad positions we're in.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Joanne, would you like to introduce yourself to everybody, please?
Hi everyone, I'm Joanne Williams. I'm the Heritage Building Surveyor in the Historic Building Climate Change Adaptation team at Historic England. It's a very long title, so I do apologise. I've been working in conservation and traditional construction for about 7 years now, having worked at the National Trust, looking after their estates and their stately home, and then at Winchester College. The main aspect of what we're trying to do at Historic England is not so much about, well, it is about listed buildings, of course it is, because we look after them, but it's also about making people aware that any building built before 1919 is made of traditional construction, and actually all of the advice and guidance we give you is completely relevant to anyone living in that type of building. I actually live in Devon myself, in a traditional little cottage, so I completely understand the impact this will have for a lot of people in Devon and Cornwall. A lot of the work we do for Historic England is working with government, reviewing legislation that's coming out and giving them advice and case studies on where the policies and legislation doesn't work for those in traditional buildings, and making sure that we give you the best advice so you don't do maladaptation and really benefit from insulating and improving your buildings in both a sustainable and correct way for traditional buildings, really.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Joanne. Okay, Professor Peter Connor, could you introduce yourself, please? Oh, you need to unmute yourself, sorry, or we can do that. Oh.
You remuted me. I think you must have pressed it at the same time.
Okay, there we go.
Apologies for that. I feel like 18 months and I've learned nothing. So I'll just go through that again. So my name is Peter Connor. I'm an associate professor of sustainable energy policy at the University of Exeter's Cornwall campus down near Falmouth. So my primary interests are in national level policy affecting renewable electricity, renewable heating, and I also look at smart grids and how we can integrate lots of renewable energy into the system. So I'm not a buildings expert, but I am working on a project which is looking at, I am the overall lead on a project which is investing about £5 million in looking at how we can get communities on board and pick the right kind of renewable heat project for a community that meets their needs, isn't just imposed on them from above. And so we're actually building some heat networks, and some other technology for low carbon heating in Norwich, in Bruges, in Mechelen, in Belgium, in Middelburg in Holland, and in a village called Formy in northern France. And we're looking at how to get policy right and how to get communication with people right, and in the hope that we can improve building quality and decarbonize their energy supply.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you. Phil, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Good evening, everyone. My name is Phil Baker. I'm a strategic planning officer with South Hams, West Devon and Plymouth councils. I write planning policy and strategies into local plan documents that shape and manage change, typically over a 20-year time horizon. And I'm the policy lead on climate change and carbon reduction for the council. So professionally, very invested and interested in what's happening in Glasgow at the moment. Personally, I was born in Totnes. If anyone can remember a time when Totnes had a maternity hospital. I grew up in Kingsbridge and I lived with my young family in the South Hams. So I'm kind of really invested and interested in what happens locally in terms of the discussions that we have and the outcomes that we can achieve, and what we as a community can show with collective endeavour in spite of a lack of direction, leadership and action at a national or global level. So I'm really pleased to contribute to tonight's discussion. Done a few of these, and if any of the other events are anything to go by, I'm probably going to learn more from the audience and the other panelists than I contribute myself, but yeah, it should be a good event. So thanks, Jim.
Thank you very much. And Simon, could you introduce yourself, please?
Good evening, and thanks for inviting me. I work with 0 Hour, the campaign for the CEE bill, and with Sustainable South Hams, which is a community outreach group that I co-founded. Starting with the big picture, the International Panel on Climate Change tell us that we need rapid and far-reaching transitions across all sectors, but you only have to look around and there's no sign of the sort of radical change that is called for, and virtually no progress in areas like homes and transport. So how does levelling up fit in? Well, in my view, if we stop our endless prevarication and truly follow the science, it would mean millions of new jobs in areas like insulation, heat pump installation, cycle path construction, improved public transport, renewable energy, nature restoration. And those on lower incomes will benefit from more and better jobs. And as Judy says, as well as, improved quality of life, being warmer. But few can afford the capital cost of the changes needed. So government must step in and act to protect our society, just like it did with COVID, and just as it's ready to in times of war. Last month's net zero strategy from the government was virtually devoid of actual policies. And those that exist are really quite woefully inadequate. The new heat pump grant is funded for only 30,000 homes a year, at which rate it would take over 800 years to retrofit our 25 million plus homes. There's no argument that tackling climate change is going to be expensive, but the cost of failure is much higher. And the good news is there's a big payback from decarbonising. Savings will actually grow to be greater than the costs by 2050, according to the Climate Change Committee, which is fantastic news. There's plenty of money too. We're a wealthy nation, but the challenge is it's in the hands of the very few, and it's also being spent on the wrong things like handouts to oil companies, big road programme, tax cuts on domestic air travel. We're even permitting new oil drilling, would you believe? The government's only pledged 4 billion to climate mitigation and 4.8 billion to levelling up. Compare that to over 100 billion on HS2, which I don't think that many people think we still need. So I believe we still can prevent the worst of climate change and achieve the levelling up agenda at the same time, but it means changing mindsets, taking responsibility, facing down vested interests, and being prepared to take bold decisions to invest in our future.
Thank you, Simon. Okay, so that's really exciting. We just had some great feedback from the chat. Really excited just hearing you all introduce yourselves. So that's a really fantastic start. And that's the whole point of these discussions, is to really open up and have a great informed discourse. So let's start by agreeing some terms of reference. So levelling up is a term that's become a commonly used political phrase. It's gained political relevance because of its connotations with ideas of social equality, social justice and aspiration. So, so panellists, there is no right and wrong. I don't think there is an official definition of what levelling up is. So I think it's a good idea just to clarify what it means to us individually. Phil, could you start? What the phrase levelling up? We hear it a lot. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I suppose I feel like I've got a kind of theoretical interpretation of what I think levelling up could be, and I suppose. Given that we know a little bit more now about kind of what the methodology has been for identifying priority areas and what the process has been for applying for investment through the Levelling Up programme, I think we kind of know what the practical application of levelling up has been as well. So I think for me, the theory is around, from a Southwest point of view, it's the opportunity to address the structural deficiencies that we've got in the Southwest region by investing in skills and innovation that are compatible with reducing emissions and supporting the delivery of the UK 10-point plan to net zero. And I think in doing so, I think there's a real opportunity there that we as a region can diversify our economy reduce the reliance that we've got on tourism and create a more resilient and sustainable economy based on renewable energy, green tech, sustainable construction, all the stuff that Simon said in his introduction. I think my limited experience of the levelling up agenda suggests that in practice, it's likely to be somewhat different. I think the basic methodology for identifying priority areas is skewed with a political bias. I think it's too short term in its aims, and it's not aligned at all, I don't think, with the climate emergency, with carbon reduction or the 10-point plan. I think it's really great that councils have been put at the heart of the funding process, but looking at the eligible products, it looks like at the moment the investment is going to be pretty much in maintaining the status quo rather than driving real change. And I've seen a number of the projects that have got funding through the first phase, things like road building projects that are kind of given funding under the guise of investment in infrastructure and transport, but it just seems like a massive missed opportunity to me.
Okay, thank you. So you talked about councils there. So Judy, maybe this is a good opportunity for you just to talk to us about what levelling up means to you, and maybe addressing some of those points around, trying to move forward beyond just the sort of the status quo.
Thank you. It's, for me, that there are a lot of contrary indications pulling us in different directions, because we have a certain statutory guidelines that we have to work within, and on the whole they don't permit us to do the things we want to do. Now, that's not entirely true, but it is true of a lot of our statutory functions. So things like planning, we're being made to build more and more houses. Now, undoubtedly people need houses, but I think my argument in the Southwest is they're not the sort of houses that we're building that people need or people want. And they certainly can't afford them. So that's the other problem. And I think there are other things we have to do that also don't accord with what we ought to be doing. There is a lot of willingness to accord with sustainability and go faster than we are allowed to go, but we just cannot. The regulations will not allow us to get there. And in some ways, it's very frustrating. I think Phil gives you the higher level. I'm giving you the low level stuff of the everyday frustrations of trying to get through the thicket of regulation and do what we need to do. And it is very frustrating.
Okay, would anybody like to pick up from there? Yes, Simon.
I've got a lot of sympathy with what Judy just said. I'm sure it is a very difficult challenge, but one suggestion is that the South Hams District Council becomes a bit more vocal publicly in terms of what it needs from government. We've spoken in Sustainable South Hams about can we bring forward a ban on gas boilers for new houses, and I realise that the District Council's hands are tied and it comes from central government, but I think we need district councils to step forward a bit more and be more vocal, and that way we might get a more rapid movement from central government.
Can I reply to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. Well, you may not hear much from South Hams itself, but we have an organisation called the District Councils Network, which is run by the Local Government Association. And I assure you, we are shouting very loudly about all those things. Now, the senior members of our organisation do have weekly meetings with ministers. So I think we're landing the message in the right place and at the right volume, but getting the government machinery to move on it is very difficult. And in fairness to ministers, I don't think it's always their fault. I think the civil service is a huge drag on all this, particularly if you want anything that's outside the M25. So that's my reply to you. We haven't given up on it at all. And you may not hear it directly from South Hams, but I assure you it's going on, and I assure you that I am quite vocal in promoting that.
Thank you. So I think this might be a good time to throw to Peter, because obviously my understanding is that you're dealing with renewable energy policy and regulation. So what are your thoughts on where we're at in the discussion? Oh, you're muted again. Sorry. So
useless. Yeah, I have to admit I hadn't realised that levelling up was something to take seriously. I assumed it was just a buzzword. I don't think we've seen any meaningful policy instruments emerge. So we've seen we've seen sort of policies been talked about and some ambitious goals set out, but I'm not sure that's translated into practical application of policy instruments at the national level. And to be honest, I think one of the problems that the UK particularly has is that it devolves so little power and so little money to the councils that it then becomes really hard to do things. And some things in some areas that's less important, and some it's more important. So things like building wind turbines, for example, that can all come from central government, and twiddle with the planning it's just so people can get permission if they tick the right boxes. But other things like energy efficiency programs and decarbonizing heat in your homes, the heat pump rollout, that has to be local. The central government can't just put out a policy instrument. You have to have councils that are engaged. You have to have people talking to communities, because the electricity, we've already got the stuff. We've already got the wires. All we need is somebody to put green electricity into the network rather than brown electricity. And so, but with heat, you have to go to the community. You have to, we're not going to, I don't think we're going to, even if you replace the gas network with a hydrogen network, which is one option, but probably a bad one, then you'd still have to go to everybody's street and replace the system. But if you're going to put heat pumps in, if you're going to put heat networks in, if you're going to do anything else, it has to be really local. And some of that stuff isn't going to happen unless you give the powers to the local community, to local councils and local communities, and you give enough money. Because let's face it, the local councils are all basically under the hammer on funding. So it's things like that. We're not really seeing the policy instruments come through to let some of those things happen. In some areas, we're not even seeing the policy targets set. So somebody I think the first question in the chat was about whether to get PV or not. The UK just doesn't have a policy on small scale PV anymore. So you can look around your town and you'll see PV panels on people's roofs. The technology price came down hugely between 2010 and 2019, not just in the UK, but globally. But it's still just a little bit too expensive for you to do it on your own, generally speaking. And it's a massive opportunity. I think somebody mentioned we have 27 million households. A lot of them have roofs. Obviously, we have other kinds of building as well. But that's a lot of roofs. There's a lot of space that's not used for anything else. So you can put a solar panel. They're not all suitable, but millions of them are. And we just don't have an incentive to get people to do that and to make that contribution and to decarbonize their own electrical usage. But that's just one example. But there are others where we just don't have meaningful policy as well, and that makes it really hard to do anything, basically.
Okay, thank you very, very much. So Joanne, could you maybe talk to us about our more historic housing stock and the challenges that you have around climate adaptation with those?
Oh God, loads. So interestingly, 30% of the buildings in the UK at the moment are historic buildings. You might not think it because they're not listed, but anything pre-1919 is technically a traditional building. They all act the same. And the problem with levelling up, for example, and suggesting air source heat pumps and insulation is they're basically saying all buildings are exactly the same and this is how you do it. And I hate to say it, one size does not fit all. Exactly how it's been mentioned, PBs aren't suitable for every single building, insulation might not be suitable, air source heat pumps might not be suitable. And I think when it comes to levelling up, obviously the government's point of it is making great places to live and creating communities. We all want that. We're all part of community. I live in a village of 60 houses. It's a very nice community. And what I don't think people understand is that actually community is not just about what you do, but it's about what your neighbours do. So we've had a property the other day in London, they're talking about the fact they flood every day. And I said, well, what are your neighbours doing about that? And they hadn't thought about it. And there's so many different aspects to climate change. And what we're really encouraging in Historic England is you want to enrich people. We want to enrich everyone in their heritage, in their culture. There is so much to learn from it. It's been proven that by repurposing abandoned houses, which there's 265,000 of them, if you did these up, actually it would benefit cities, it would benefit villages, it would stop them becoming redundant places. And it was proven that a mill, if they did a study on loads of mills in the north, and one mill could offer something like 500 houses, or it could offer 50,000 job opportunities. And there's so many old mills that are abandoned, industrial buildings that are abandoned, and they're in derelict conditions, very easy to adapt because they've lost a lot of their heritage features. But we're building these new buildings that are meant to last 100 years. Yet your heritage buildings have been there, well, the one I'm living in has been here 200 years. You've got buildings that have been around since the 1350s. The most embodied carbon you've got in is a house that's already built, not in the one that's coming.
Thank you very much. Really, really interesting. So that could lead down all sorts of avenues of discussion now. I mean, just before we move on to someone else on the panel, Joanne, you know, sort of historic houses, you know, can be a huge drain anyway financially, and hugely costly. I mean, sort of. Are we in any position at the moment? Is there any kind of policy and funding there to support you know, sort of installing better forms of energy supply, for example, within historic houses? What kinds of things do you have to put in place?
It's a hard one, actually, and I'm not saying you're wrong, Jim. A lot of people say that old buildings are really expensive to maintain and that they're very costly to, you know, do your fuel costs. But actually, a lot of it comes down to maintenance, and it also comes down to what we've done to these buildings. I hate to say it, but in the 90s, there was a mass thing about putting damp-proof courses on, cement rendering your building. And that's why they're not energy efficient anymore. As soon as you've installed a cement render onto a solid wall, it can't breathe, it can't buffer the moisture, you're causing damp issues in your building, you're also preventing all of your external heat from getting into a building. It's also, maintenance is one of the biggest issues. If you've got a damp building, it's not going to perform. If you hit the building, when you've got a small defect, be it clearing your gutters out every 6 months, you're going to prevent dry rot coming into your building, you're going to prevent wet rot, you're going to prevent render falling off, all of which will then environmentally affect how sustainable your building's being. That being said, some buildings are very expensive to maintain, which I appreciate. And there are answers. And Historic England, we have got the HAS scheme, which is the High Street Action Scheme, where we are working in different high streets to put money into them to improve their energy efficiency and make the communities a lot more nicer. Closest one being Clumpton at the moment in Devon. I think they're also doing one in Plymouth somewhere, but I'm not sure on that. We are also looking at grant funding, but Historic England's a very small section of the government. So at the moment, we are fighting to try and do grant funding for installation programmes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for answering that so fully. Thank you. So, the chat is really developing. It's really interested in this discussion, particularly around housing. But of course, sort of levelling up is not just to do with housing. You know, it's to do with sort of general living costs. And I just wanted to put to the panel, you know, how are we? Do we feel in our own areas of expertise, in terms of what actions have been put in place to ensure that the most deprived are not disproportionately disadvantaged, you know, in this climate crisis, and the things that need to be done, you know, to move towards net zero? Maybe Simon, you could step in.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I probably have a few more things to say on levelling up, having responded to Judy, and thanks, Judy, for you're obviously doing more behind the scenes. Although I would say I think you might get more results if you do it publicly. It's easier for the government to ignore you in back channels, but I'm sure I don't know the full picture.
Just back.
What I wanted to say about levelling up is that it's, you know, we have to think about why we're doing this for a start. It's because inequality's got so much worse in the UK, and that's actually feeding into causing climate change, because the very wealthiest, the wealthiest 1% in the UK have a carbon footprint 11 times someone in the poorest half. You know, so these lavish lifestyles that people are leading are damaging the planet, causing climate change and wrecking biodiversity. So as well as limiting that damage, we also have the opportunity to raise a large amount of funding in order to tackle climate change. The problem is that the amount dedicated to climate change in the UK so far is 4 billion, as I said, and then we have a 4.8 billion levelling up fund. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, there are 14 million people in poverty in the UK, so that divides down to £340 each. But then you read further, and the 4.8 billion funds over 4 years, it's that usual trick of trying to make it sound better than it is. So we're talking about less than £100 per person. You know, that's not going to deal with the problem. It's just window dressing. It's a small sum just to back up an election slogan. And then you look further and you read that actually the government's being taken to court by the Good Law Project, because 1 billion of this funding's gone to 40 towns out of 45, which were in conservative constituencies. It's not been actually handed out according to any assessment of poverty. So, you know, I think what we actually really have to do to ensure that people don't suffer at the poorer end of the scale in the climate crisis is the government's got to just change its mindset. We can't have this incrementalist approach of fighting over, you know, avoiding spending to avoid any major changes to people, to vested interests. We've got to stop spending money on things that are making the climate crisis worse. You know, we're allowing new drilling for oil and gas and a new coal mine. We have to increase taxes on the wealthiest and big companies. And it goes against the grain, but we've got to face up to limiting personal choice, such as banning private jets and big taxes on people who take lots of flights, and actually do something about the problem of meat. I don't know what the solution is, but we've got to do something because it's 16% of global emissions. So at the moment, it's all window dressing, and you know, and I don't think there's anyone in this room who can actually necessarily do something about it. But you could sign up to support the Climate Ecological Emergency Bill, which would actually make it a legal requirement to tackle the climate change, to tackle the climate crisis. And I think that's actually what we need. The government needs to jump in, make a legally binding commitment, and then that will stimulate a whole load of activity. At the moment, it's just talk.
Okay, thank you. Judy, just because, you know, would you like to respond to that in terms of the Climate Ecology Bill, you know, and South Hams District Council positioning on that?
Yeah, we've already passed a motion to support it. So in a sentence, you know, we've said we're behind it.
And what needs to happen next then?
Well, it needs to be presented in Parliament, and they need to get it through Parliament. But the problem is at the moment that they haven't got the support to get it through Parliament, in spite of all the, you know, all the lobbying that's been done. So we can't do any more than we've done. You know, and so if Parliament doesn't want to pass the bill, then it won't get through. That's where it is at the moment, I'm afraid.
So, so you know, if people are in support of the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill and want to enable that support in Parliament, what should we be doing?
Well, you can certainly lobby your MP if you want to. That's one way of getting it through. But at the moment, as far as I know, there weren't any Conservative MPs supporting it at all.
So, so it's become a party political issue.
It always was a party political issue. I'm not sure. Perhaps Simon can tell us whether it's been reintroduced to Parliament. It was due to be reintroduced in September, but I haven't had any news that it has been. Perhaps he can tell us that.
Yes, it has been, and thank you as well, Judy, for the council supporting it. That really makes a difference. I would actually say I don't believe it is party political, because there are councils all across the country of all stripes that are behind this. I think it's just a very sensible thing to do. If we believe what we say about tackling the climate and nature crisis, why not just make it legally binding? So yes, it's been reintroduced, but one of the big objections I hear from Anthony Mangnall, who I met to discuss about this, is that he says it's only a private member's bill, and private members' bills rarely become law. But he's missing the point that what we actually want is for the government to people like Anthony Mangnall and his colleagues in the climate network to come out and actually support the bill. And if they do, then the government could adopt it. And with a big thumping majority, the government could pass it, and they could pass it quickly. You know, we're a sovereign nation, and if we need to do something urgently, and I'm sure no one disagrees that this is urgent, they can get it passed. So I think, yes, just please keep asking Anthony to support it. I'm sure he must. I'm sure he must be tempted. I think he's following the whips at the moment. He's a young MP. He's, you know, I've met him. He wants to do something about it, and clearly the only way to do it is to make it legally binding, in my view.
Okay, thank you. What we'll possibly come back to the CE bill later, but just picking up on something that was mentioned earlier around sort of new developments. You know, Phil, maybe you could help us with this one. That when housing developers want to build large new estates, are they obligated? Is there a legal framework around ensuring that they're using sustainable building methods and that they're installing things like air source heat pumps, etc.? What are the obligations on new builds at the moment?
Thank you, Jimmy. I saw the question pop up in the chat there, and I suppose in summary, I would describe it perhaps as being something like a national disgrace. The fact that our building control regime and building regulations that houses are still being built to now are still set at 2013 standards. A large developer, a national volume house builder, for example, building a large development, because they're large, risky projects to get off the ground, they take a few years to come to fruition. So a scheme being built now probably got planning permission somewhere upwards of sort of 4 or 5 years ago. And because of the deficiencies in the system, at the point where a planning permission is granted, a developer can fix their building regulation standards at that point. So it's so retrospective, it's so slow, it's so it's whatever the opposite of forward thinking is, backward thinking. There you go. You know, it's because there's such a strong lobbyist process within the development sector. That we are building homes now that are immediately ready for retrofit. It is a national disgrace. Unfortunately, you know, often we kind of hear people talk about the built form, and particularly domestic dwellings in particular, as being much better in Europe and Northern Europe in particular. Speaking to a friend of mine in Sweden last week, and he's having exactly the same issues with the home that he's just moved into. Everything is driven by the bottom line. Everything starts and finishes with land prices, and the developer is then beholden to what they can squeeze out of a piece of land that they've already paid over the odds for. And the people that are then lumbered with trying to make this dwelling fit for purpose are the occupants who've already overpaid for it because the market's inflated in the first place. There are so many things that need to change to kind of to get us in a position where the people that have got the most to benefit from living in that property are able to do so. And it's not the national volume house builder. Radical land reform around price caps for land would be a good start. And I think probably a degree of public subsidy around building materials, so sustainable construction materials. If as a government we are always, as a nation, if we're prepared to subsidise aviation fuel and give tax breaks for domestic flights, then why are we not putting ourselves in a position where we're going to do the same for construction materials if it means that people that are buying those dwellings can live in a warm and efficient and a thermally efficient building? The Future Home Standard is finally going to come into play. The transition levels for building regulations are being uplifted next year to a degree, and that's a transitionary step towards 2025 when the Future Home Standard comes in, which is an uplift in the building regulations. So there will be, the baseline for assessing new buildings will be increased and improved, but it's still not as far as we need it to go. It's still taking ages to roll out. The first consultation for this was in 2019. And it's just because the development sector is not ready or prepared to change at a rate that we need them to, and really that the consumers are demanding as well.
Gosh, so Peter, I mean, listening to that, is that something that you would agree with, that positioning on where things are at?
Yeah, where basically our housing stock. I think I have seen data that says our housing stock's worse than Sweden. It's in a pretty bad state considering how far north we are. And somebody mentioned, and somebody I think has already made a case in the chat about the EPCs not really being fit for purpose. And I think that's true. So I agree absolutely with Phil on the future homes policy that's coming through that doesn't really sort of bite until 2025. And basically, yeah, we were supposed to introduce something that probably would have been a little bit stronger than that in 2016, and it was thrown out essentially because I think the building companies had the ear of the government around the 2014-15 period. So basically, everything we built between 2016 and 2025 is substandard. It's below the standard that we knew we needed to have, and so yeah, as Phil says, it's and that's potentially, I haven't got the numbers, but usually you can use a rule of thumb is that we turn over about 1% of our housing stock. So that's about 9% of our housing stock that will exist in 2050 when we're supposed to be net zero is using more energy than it needed to, and is using currently obviously largely carbon energy to do that with. And at the same time, it's running up bills. So the people who are living there are much more likely to fall into fuel poverty. And if they're not in fuel poverty, their bills will be higher than they needed to be. And those are not the only things that have impacted on that as well. So some of the things that were in place to protect the fuel poor particularly were gotten rid of at about the same time. So we had things in place where energy companies were forced to go and put insulation into your house and the cavity wall and your attic and things like that. And that was cut back as well. And so yeah, and I think there is a big issue with big companies having the ear of government and having a demonstrated ability to influence what has gone on. And we can see that there was an announcement a couple of weeks ago that we're going to go with mini nukes produced by Rolls-Royce, and we're kind of now that's written into our climate change policy, and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But that seems a little bit it doesn't really seem like a concrete foundation. So yeah, we're in a pretty bad state in terms of our housing.
Wow. Okay, I'm gonna throw to Joanne and then throw back to Judy, and then we're going to move on to another levelling up subject. So Joanne, you've got your hand up. Which is just
I'm on mute as well. I just raise because obviously it's been brought up and Peter's just brought it up with EPCs. Just to cut it a bit short, there has been a massive consultation on it. It was done back in 2020, I think it was. We're still going through it. Historic England is very much involved. We're not just looking at it from solid buildings either. We're looking at the whole thing. EPCs are based on data of buildings from 1965. So if your material is older than anything from 1965, including modern construction, we do not know the U values. We have flagged that it's a failing system that does not work. You could literally be an ice cream driver the one day, and 3 days later you get an EPC assessment, and you could go out and assess buildings. They know absolutely nothing about construction. Some do. Obviously, you have the odd building surveyor who goes and becomes a DEA, but a lot of them don't. And it is a failing system we are working on. And anyone at the moment, if you can get an exemption on a listed building, get it exempted. It will give you 5 years to then plan how to move it forward. Because at the moment, no one knows what's happening with fuels. Someone's flagged that they've got air source heat pumps in 2 of their flats, I think they said, and oil in another, and the oil's performing better. EPCs are driving fossil fuels at the moment, and it's so detrimental. And we don't know if in 5 years, when we decarbonise the national grid, if we do, if electric systems are going to perform better. So it's a very hard one, but if you've got a listed building, get it exempted under the Third Party Consent Act, and it will give you 5 years to future plan. because if it's the same with traditional buildings, there are other exemptions. If you devalue your house by 5%, or if it's going to cost you, I think, more than £3,500 to do it, just wait until we kind of, the legislation kind of levels out a bit, which should hopefully be March next year. But if you don't rent, you don't need to worry. So that's, if you're not renting or selling, don't worry at the moment.
Thank you, Joanne, for that. Judy, I wanted to throw back to you just around this, just before we move on, about developers. The idea that surely if developers aren't building with net zero at the forefront of their construction plans, I mean, shouldn't they be, not granted? They should be refused building permission.
Well, I would absolutely agree with you, but unfortunately, that's not the position we're in now. We've recently run into an interesting problem where a developer said he was going to put air source heat pumps in 14 flats. When it came to it, there wasn't a sufficient electricity supply to supply those 14 heat pumps. So Peter might be interested in this problem. And it appears that you can then just turn around and say, oh, well, Western Power can't guarantee the supply because it's got to come over third-party land. Therefore, we're not going to install them. Now, this raises two problems. First of all, is that true, and have they sufficiently gone into it? And that's the argument we're using with them. But the second thing is that if you're on the coast, you are kind of the end of the line. I know a lot of electricity comes across the channel under the sea, but as far as Western Power is concerned, we're the end of the line. And so it's going to be a huge problem actually getting power down into southwest Devon to power all the buildings we shall need to power, and all the EV charging points, and all the rest of it. I think this is going to be a problem all over the country. So I'm sure that Peter is right, that the answer is small local generation and local schemes to provide the power that is needed for a village or a development or whatever. But actually persuading the developers to do that, we've got some policies in our local plan that provide for that, but there are alternatives, and they are always using the alternatives to get out of actually doing that. But I'm sure that's the way forward. Local generation is going to be beautiful very soon. It was right at the beginning of electricity, and now it's gone away to the grid and all the rest of it, which is in some ways efficient, but in other ways inefficient. And I think we need to get back to local power. I'd be interested to hear what Peter says about that, but I think that's where he's coming from too.
Peter.
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, yeah, I don't think we're going to be in a position for many people to go off grid in the near future, but I do favour having much more distributed energy. Having solar panels on roofs just makes sense, especially down here in the south of England. It's there's potential price gains still to come. So we need to work on that. Essentially, we can get gigawatts of power that way. And it would be a good fit with when we consume energy. So yeah, I see that as a necessity. Yeah, I think beyond that, then in terms of things like offshore wind, I think you're going to have big centralized generators that are going to be and can deliver large volumes of our power. So it's kind of a mix. So yeah, offshore is still, if you put 10 gigawatts of offshore, then it's bigger than any of our onshore power stations in terms of what it delivers down a single cable. So that can still be effective. So yeah, I'm pro a mix in terms of electricity, but in terms of heat, it has to be local. It has to be done in your town, basically. So I don't think there's a realistic hydrogen option to replace methane. There's a lot of people saying that now, and I know the gas companies are still sort of flogging the idea that it's a possibility. And so we're going to have to look at heat networks and lots of heat pumps. And I think Phil mentioned earlier that scaling up to that is going to be a tremendous challenge. And we've set, again, this goes back to what I said earlier, we've set a big target. So the 10-point plan in November last year says 600,000 new heat pumps installed every year by 2028. But Phil mentioned that only about 30,000 are going to get support from the government, and I think there are other problems with that. I don't think we have enough people trained, and getting the right number of people trained at the right time is going to be a big challenge, and persuading people that a heat pump is right for them. So making the up the early ground is going to be a big challenge. So, you know, if your boiler fails tomorrow, it could fail tomorrow. You know, we've all just started turning our heating on again. If your boiler failed, then you're looking at, you know, what you're going to do to replace it by next week so that you're not freezing. Would you go with a heat pump over a boiler? That's a very difficult thing to persuade somebody to do. If your grand's heat boiler went, would you trust a heat pump to go and give it the same heat all through the winter? I'm not saying they don't work. I'm absolutely not saying that, because I know that they do, but there's still a big issue in persuading people that they work and they're an effective solution. And getting all of that done is going to be a massive challenge, and it's going to fall locally, because it's going to be all about things like word of mouth, about training for local companies, all of those things, about getting the planning permissions, about having the access. All of those things are going to be, you know, there's going to take a lot of work to get that moving forward. And when I say 600,000, somebody mentioned we have about 27 million households. We currently have 67,000 heat pumps in the UK. So getting 600,000 a year is massive increase. It's going to be hugely challenging, and that absolutely will be a local issue for every single council in the UK.
Thank you, Peter. And Simon, yes, I saw your virtual hands up on the chat.
I just wanted to say that I think Judy is exactly right in what she says about local power generation. But I wanted to add that wind power, onshore wind power, is the cheapest form of renewable energy. And it's effectively barred by the planning laws by central government, because, you know, it stems from a time where there was a lot of talk in the newspapers about people not wanting them nearby. There's so much potential for onshore wind. And in fact, you know, if it's coupled with a change in the regulations around how electricity is supplied, so that people can supply electricity between each other locally, there's a great opportunity for local community groups to generate a revenue stream, you know, or just a community group to benefit the families in the local area with the profits of generation perhaps going to be able to insulate their homes, and so there's a lovely sort of circular virtuous circle that can come from that. But again, it comes back to the central government needing to change the laws and actually you know, grasp the nettle in some things that where you know, make some changes where there will be a vociferous opposition from some people, but it has to be done. And then just picking back up on what Peter says, yeah, you know, I agree on heat pumps, and in fact the government's 10-point plan with the 600,000 heat pumps a year, even that's not enough. When you do the maths, it's got to be, you know, probably twice. It's got to ramp up to probably twice that. And I'm sorry to plug the CEE bill again, but the best way to demonstrate commitment, solid commitment, and get companies to pile in and invest and expand the supply chain is to make a legal commitment. The trouble is the government's brought in grant schemes and they've collapsed, and no one trusts that they're going to endure, so they're not prepared to risk their businesses. What we need is a solid legal commitment backed by funding, and I'm not talking about the sort of 4 billion level that we've had. It's got to be backed by, like, you know, it's got to be in the scale of HS2. Cancel HS2 and let's redivert those funds. And then what we need is a training centre in every town. Totnes should have you know, a centre for alternative technology like the one in Wales, where people can just drop in and actually see what these heat pumps are, see smart controls, you know, see solar panels, and talk to people who can give them advice about whether their quotes are realistic or fair. And those people can also be training up young people to become the engineers of tomorrow. And that's just not happening. None of this is happening. So I just go back to what I said at the start, that we've had a government net zero report, which is just ambition. And we just don't have time to waste. That needs to be translated into actual policies and action backed by funding.
Thank you. Just at the end there, you were talking about ambition, Simon, and this is a question from the chat for you, Peter. There are other people are more than welcome to you know, to join in. Last year, Boris Johnson announced that by 2030, offshore wind would provide enough energy for all the homes in the UK. Is that going to happen?
Well, what he was doing when he made that point was, I think, a specific. He was playing around with the numbers a little bit. So at the moment, we have about 10 gigawatts of onshore wind and we have 10 gigawatts of offshore wind, and that produces about 10% of the UK's entire electrical needs. And then we have another 10% of our electrical needs comes from onshore wind. So, and then on the other side, on the demand side, about 35% of our electricity is used in homes. So basically what he was doing was to say 10 gigawatts of offshore wind produces 10% of our power. We're going to move to 40 gigawatts of offshore wind, and that will produce 40% of our power, and that's more than the 35% we get from that is used in our homes. So if we get to 40 gigawatts, then we'll be powering all of our homes from electricity. And it's a good headline and it's a good little soundbite, but of course it kind of leaves aside that 2/3 of the electricity we use isn't in our homes. And in the future, and this is where this becomes an issue, potentially if we're going to have all those heat pumps in our homes, our demand for electricity is going to be a lot bigger. And if we're all going to have electric vehicles, our demand for electricity is going to be hugely bigger. So it's likely, if we go down those routes, and the most obvious ones at the moment, that we'll use 2 or possibly 3 times as much electricity as we currently do. And if that's the case, then 40 gigawatts won't let us do all of our homes. But that's basically the soundbite that they boiled out of that sort of the mathematics of that situation. So it's doable. 40 gigawatts is a fairly ambitious target. I'd say it's actually one of the deliverable targets because we already have a policy mechanism that can achieve it. So we already have a lot of offshore wind in our that has been awarded contracts and that will will be built and start to deliver power in between now and about 2027. I think the contracts are up to, and each one of those new contracts has been for less cost per unit of energy. So the cost, we've seen massive cost drops for the offshore wind stuff. So yeah, I think there's a real chance we'll get to that figure, that 40 gigawatts that was in the Prime Minister's announcement back in November. And then the question then is how much solar and how much onshore wind we'll get on top of it. So I think the Prime Minister said we would have a relaxation of the planning and the thing that Phil talked about, and it's whether that happens in reality, and then it's whether we get any incentives to build more solar. I think we'll see big solar farms. I think there's about a colleague, well, one of my graduates who's now quite senior, told me the other day that there's about 3 gigawatts in the planning process nationally for large scale solar. Not so much for virtually nothing for solar you put on your house. So some of these things are achievable, but for the onshore, we definitely need to have the relaxation of planning, and it needs to be clear that you're going to be able to get through the planning process to the wind industry. Because if you're putting together an onshore wind planning thing, then you're probably spending £100,000 before you get anywhere just to get to the planning process. And if you keep failing, you'll stop. And so if we want that to happen, it has to be clear that you're going to be able to get through that process. So yeah, it's the power, the 40%, 40 gigawatt thing is absolutely doable. We need to go further than that, and we can go further than that with the proper policy on solar and wind.
Thank you, Peter. Phil, you've had your virtual hand up for a while. I apologise for not getting to you sooner.
No, that's okay, and it's not just because I've forgotten to turn it down. Take that. Just a couple of points with regard to some of the stuff that Simon said about onshore wind. The government have been smart enough not to introduce a blanket ban on onshore wind. They've just been so obstructive in terms of the hurdles that a planning authority has to go through to allocate a site for onshore wind that most haven't taken up the challenge. But as Peter's rightly said, there has been a promise that the National Planning Policy Framework is going to be revised more in line with the climate emergency. And if this doesn't remove that restriction on the process for allocating onshore wind, I'd be massively surprised. There will still be obviously some significant tests that you have to go through before you allocate a site or give a permission for onshore wind. There are a number of, there's still a number of kind of tests that they have to be subject to. But surely we're in a position now where public perception in terms of things like landscape harm needs to be reframed within and kind of seen through just a different lens now. We can't afford to just kind of continue to trot out the same old sort of challenges with regard to onshore wind in terms of people not liking them visibly in the landscape. Whereas, you know, as I think we're all in agreement, you can't really have a properly and healthy, diverse supply of energy without onshore wind playing a part in that. The other thing I would say that I completely agree with Simon on is the ridiculous underfunding of the 10-point plan towards net zero. I think Simon's made reference to HS2 a couple of times, and that's quite a sobering reference, and I've heard that made before. The other one is the public bailout of RBS, and again, the amount of public funds that were put to that for the benefit of well, obviously the account holders, but fundamentally for the shareholders. It just kind of it really does cast things in a really sobering light. One final thing, and I think Peter and I have been in accordance on this before in another event. Just a small tokenistic reintroduction of a feed-in tariff for roof-mounted solar, just to kind of re-stimulate the supply chains, and you know it's a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned. Massively reduces the amount of demand and take out the grid in the first place, and so many roofs are just crying out for it. It just seems like such an easy win, but there you go.
Wow, thank you so much. So Massimo, who is one of the co-pilots on this Zoom, Massimo, I can't launch the poll for some reason, but we have got a poll, and I wonder, Massimo, whether you might be able to launch that for our viewers to participate in.
Of course, Jim.
Yeah, thank you.
And just to point out that the co-hosts, you may not see it or be able to fill it in. But you will see the results in a few moments. So if I can ask people to just the rest of the audience to fill in that poll.
Okay.
So we have 32 non-speakers tech support people, and the answers are coming in.
Okay, so what I can do is for the panel that can't see it, I will be able to,
when I share it.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, fantastic.
Finished, we'll be there. We're at 14 out of 32. So we're about halfway now. We're past halfway. We'll give it a few more moments.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. And then after we've had the results from the poll, I would like to just sort of sum up. I'd like to touch base first of all with Judy and Joanne one last time, and then we'll be looking at wrapping up. We won't be tackling transport this evening. Obviously, that's a very key area, but we might well be looking at that next week, next Tuesday, when we talk about the Environment Bill and looking at transport then.
So if anybody hasn't managed to fill that in yet, I apologize. I'm going to end the poll. That's 27 out of 32. Well, it's still creeping up, but just I'm going to stop that now, and then I'm going to share the results. So hopefully everybody should be able to see that. If any of you panelists can't see it, just raise your hand. And some of the questions are quite long. You may be able to click and drag the edge to widen out those questions, but they give you the idea. Over to you, Jim.
Okay, fantastic. So, Judy, I just want to return to you. Just, you know, a lot of what we've been talking around really seems to be to do with planning, you know. One of the things that's really resonated with me, it was these discussions about planning and a sense that maybe the district councils are slightly powerless in the face of developers who aren't planning with the rigor and the net zero goals in mind, and what can happen around that. Do we need a tighter policy framework to hold developers to account, or do we have those policies but for some reason it's just not happening?
We definitely need tighter policy framework to hold them to account. We're very fortunate we've got the joint local plan, which has pretty good climate change policies in it compared with plans that other people have got. Now, we were allowed to demand 20% above the basic standard that is currently mandated, but that 20% is not enough. And I have to say that on the whole, the developers find fairly weaselly ways of getting away with their 20%. And I think what's true is that members are demanding more. So the officers are obliged to stick to the letter of the law, but we're finding that members in committee are actually sometimes going against officers and demanding more. Now, that is their prerogative. They can do that, and it doesn't mean that they're fighting officers. It means they're fighting the regulations that say that you can't have more. So I think the officers are clear on that. Certainly, I'm sure the members are, because it's not willfully against the officers at all. But yes, we would like to have much better regulations so that we can go a lot further. And I'm sure Phil would agree with that. And the question is, how do we get it? And how do we get over this problem of always being 4 or 5 years in arrears? Because we're all moving forward very fast on this, but because of the way the planning system is structured, what is being built, and the developers love it because it's cheaper and it's easier and that's what they're used to, is 4 or 5 years in arrears of where we would all like to be. And I hope Phil will agree with what I've just said.
Do you agree, Phil?
In a public forum, I couldn't not, could I? But fortunately, I do as well. And typically, local planning documents, they're pretty dry reads. They don't really change much from one decade to another. But look, this is an unprecedented time of change. There's loads of groundswell of opinion that would demand that we do things differently. And traditionally as well, it's the local members that don't have a great appetite for us to be really ambitious in our local planning documents. But Judy, you've just given a ringing endorsement there for the fact that next time round, we are going to be as ambitious and forward-looking as possible. And I don't think we'll be the only ones either.
Okay, thank you, Phil. And Joanne, what, magic wand time, what would be the sort of the sort of biggest easy wins over the next couple of years in your field that would change the landscape in climate adaptation for historic buildings?
I wouldn't say it's an easy win, but it's definitely one that needs to happen, is this misrepresentation that traditional buildings are not, they're not durable, they're not energy efficient, they're not effective. And I think that stems from guidance that people are given, and weirdly it stems back to the Victorian times and all the sewage systems going into the London places. But no, it's mostly about people's understanding. And I saw someone in the chat saying about they wanted to install double glazing. We're not technically anti it, you just have to justify it. But it's not about taking something out and putting something new in, and that is what modern construction does. That's retrofitting. If there is nothing wrong with that window has embodied carbon in it. That window has been made, it had a carbon debt, and it is paying that carbon debt off. Now, secondary glazing has been proven to be nearly as effective as double glazing. Shutters have been proven to be nearly as effective as double glazing. Traditional construction, there is so much we can learn from it. And I think this is what is a shame about modern buildings nowadays, is we're not learning from it. We decided to get technologically advanced to try and prevent water from coming into our buildings, where actually there's nothing wrong with water coming into our buildings. They breathe naturally, they're not going to overheat. And that is a massive problem. 70% of the south is going to overheat, and the traditional buildings with solid walls won't. And I think it's about getting that education to people. It's about having consultants and energy advisors and retrofitters not coming to a traditional house and going, you need to do that. And we do have tons of guidance on it. And I know a lot of people probably think, go to Historic England website, we're going to be talking about listed buildings, but we're not. We have so much information on insulating solid walls. And we do so many case studies. We're doing case studies on retrofit from 10 years ago to see what the issues were. Did it work? Has the maintenance happened? And all this technology that's coming out now, building surveyors and architects, we aren't going to know how to deal with it in 10 years. And I think that's a problem. Whereas if you use your traditional methods and materials that have worked for hundreds, yet thousands of years, we're all going to know how to deal with them in the future. So that's, yeah, it's not an easy one. There's no easy wins, I'm afraid. It's timing.
But that's a lovely way to end, because actually to wrap up this discussion around, actually, you know, there are solutions that are more to do with sort of education and being informed and being open to you know, to ways that things have been done before. And I think that's, you know, in effect, that costs very little, doesn't it? And I think that that's, you know, that's a really positive and important way to end. So thank you very much, panel, for joining us and for giving us your time. That was a really valuable and very interesting discussion. And thank you, everybody, all the non-participants, for your comments in the chat. We'll be going through those and sharing information with people. There will be another discussion this Friday on democracy in the climate crisis. It's called Democracy in the Climate Crisis, Who's Really in Control? Amnesty International are going to be present, and we're going to have Anthea Simons from West Country Bylines as well. So that proves to be a very interesting discussion coming up. So thank you very much, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you on Friday, and for the remaining 3 sessions. If you would like to take part, if you would like to view again, well then please just email TotnesTalks@gmail.com. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, everybody at home.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.